The council envoys arrived on schedule, and that was the first thing that unnerved me. Not because punctuality was alarming in itself. In my 11 years working fleet communications, 4 of them on diplomatic attachment, 2 in the survey corridor, and the rest aboard vessels whose primary purpose was to find things before those things found us, I had learned to read the texture of an encounter as carefully as I read a sensor return. And what I read in the council formation's arrival was not merely punctuality. It was rehearsed punctuality. They had been waiting somewhere behind the transit threshold, watching our approach, counting down to a moment they had pre-selected. They wanted us to know they had arrived on time. They wanted us to understand that they were the kind of people who arrived on time. I noted it in my log and said nothing to Commander Vierles. He had enough to manage. The Ardent Compact was not, by any conventional measure, an impressive ship. She was a diplomatic frigate, which meant she was built not to intimidate, but to suggest that intimidation was possible without proving it. Long in proportion to her beam, with a hull configuration that Terran naval design had spent a decade refining to read as purposeful rather than threatening, she carried the external profile of a vessel that had things to do and no particular interest in being dramatic about doing them. Her weapons arrays were recessed. Her sensor mast was rated for broad-spectrum diplomatic monitoring rather than fire control precision. Her drive signature, deliberately tuned, registered on alien sensors as moderate, capable of maneuver, nothing more. She was a face, a carefully constructed, thoroughly deliberate face. She had a crew of 61, including 4 members of the Terran Diplomatic Service, and an intelligence attaché whose formal title was Cultural Liaison Officer, and whose actual function was not something I will describe in this document. The crew ran the standard 2-watch cycle during the approach phase, with the senior watch overlapping the scheduled diplomatic sessions by an hour on each side. I was senior watch on communications and sensors, which meant I worked 12 hours out of every 24 and spent most of the remaining 12 in a state the crew's medical officer had once described, with clinical precision as alert fatigue, not tired enough to rest, too occupied to disengage. What she was not, and what no one in the council formation had any way of knowing, was alone. I knew that. I had known it since we crossed the transit threshold 6 days earlier. I had the Vigil *S last confirmed position in my head, cross-referenced against our own course corrections, updated with the brief tight beam pulse she had sent us at 43 hours out. I could close my eyes on the bridge and place her within 3,000 kilometers of where she actually was. I had never been able to verify that. The Vigil didn't lend herself to verification, but I had spent 11 years reading sensor returns, and I had developed an instinct for the shape of an absence. The Vigil asterisk had a shape. If you knew what you were looking for, you could feel the place in the data where something large was choosing not to be seen. I knew what I was looking for, and I did not mention it in any of my communications with the Council Formation Signals Officer, a being called Second Voice Terath, who spoke to me 3 times a day in the polished, careful syntax of someone who had studied human speech patterns from recordings rather than from experience. Terath was professional, thorough, and precisely as revealing as a sealed diplomatic pouch. I liked Terath, in the abstract way you come to appreciate an opponent who is good at the same game you are. We were 6 days into the approach formation, by the time I am talking about. 6 days of the *Ardent Compact riding in loose parallel with the Council Envoy element, 3 ships in their formation, 5 including the 2 escort corvettes that ran off their flanks at a respectful distance. The lead vessel was the Deliberation of the 7th Convened Asterisk, a ship whose name I had memorized, and whose profile I had spent a considerable number of off-watch hours committing to memory. She was larger than us, though not dramatically so, built on a principle of distributed mass that made her look like a collection of considered decisions rather than a single unified hull. Her flanks carried the council seals of 14 member polities, each in a different spectral register, so that her hull read differently depending on what wavelength you used to look at her. I thought about that design choice more than was probably professionally appropriate. A ship that showed you different faces depending on how you looked at it. I wondered if that was intentional. I decided it almost certainly was. The second council vessel was the Asterisk Record of Considered Motion Asterisk, a heavier ship than her name suggested, more military in her lines, though she carried no armament that our passive arrays could confirm. She maintained a position slightly aft of the lead ship and to her starboard, in a configuration that a human fleet officer would have recognized as a protective disposition. She was watching the Ardent Compact the way a second officer watches the horizon during a courtesy call. Present, undemonstrative, entirely ready. The third was the Asterisk Patience of the Assembly Asterisk, and she was the one that interested me most, because she was the smallest of the three and she moved differently from the others. Where the Asterisk Deliberation and the Asterisk Record held their positions with the careful steadiness of vessels under active attitude management, the Patience had a quality I could only describe as stillness. Not the stillness of a ship holding station. The stillness of a ship that had been still for a long time and had no reason to change. She was, our intelligence attaché had assessed prior to departure, the Council's primary signals and assessment platform. She was, in the plain language I used in my own private log, the ship that was most carefully listening to us. I was, by the same logic, the person most carefully listening to her. This was the world 6 days in. Formal exchanges twice daily, technical protocols observed to the letter, the shared vocabulary of interstellar diplomacy deployed by both sides with the care of people who understood that language was also a weapon and also a gift, and that right now it was neither. It was a bridge, and bridges required maintenance. Commander Virlas handled the formal sessions with the Council's lead diplomat, a being called First Speaker Odilith, whose voice in translation carried a quality I cannot adequately describe, something between deliberateness and exhaustion, as though each word had been considered many times before being released. The commander was good. I had worked with worse. He understood the weight of silence and he did not rush to fill it, which is rarer than it should be. My job was everything underneath the formal sessions, the technical channel, the passive monitoring, the cross-referencing of what the Council formation sensor arrays were scanning against what our own systems were registering, the steady, untheatrical work of building a picture. What I was building, 6 days in, was a picture of a coalition that was more uneasy than it had shown us. It was in small things. The Patience Asterisk S sensor sweeps had a pattern broad, methodical, covering the standard threat arcs, and that pattern had a repetition interval that I had clocked at 4 hours, 22 minutes for the first 3 days. On day 4 it shortened to 3 hours, 41 minutes. On day 5 to 2 hours, 58 minutes. On the morning of day 6 I clocked 2 full sweeps in a single hour. The Patience was looking harder. She had not found anything because the Vigil Asterisk was not findable, but the fact that she was looking harder told me that something in her previous sweeps had registered as anomalous, not a contact, an absence, the shape of a thing that wasn't there. I logged it. I sent a compressed notation to Commander Virlas. I kept it out of my exchanges with Second Voice Terath. What I felt in those 6 days I will try to describe accurately because I think it matters. I was not afraid. I had been afraid in other situations. Aboard the Asterisk Survey Meridian in the Keth Corridor, when we had come out of a transit point into a debris field that our charts had not predicted, and the debris had been the wrong kind of debris. Aboard the compact Asterisk S predecessor, the ISV harbored Grace Asterisk, when a boarding protocol had gone sideways, and I had spent 4 hours locked in a communications bay not knowing whether the people on the other side of the door were the ones who were supposed to be there. I knew what fear felt like in a professional context. It had a specific texture, a narrowing of attention, a heightening of certain frequencies in everything you could perceive, a sense that the clock had shifted to a different gear. What I felt in those 6 days was something else, closer to the feeling I had carried for the entire briefing period before departure, when the senior communications staff had been walked through the Vigil *S deployment parameters by a fleet admiral whose name I am not going to reproduce in a document that may be classified at any level below maximum restricted. The feeling that we were participating in something whose outcome we had modeled extensively, and whose actual outcome was genuinely unknowable. The feeling of a well-designed plan at the moment before execution, when all the variables that the plan accounts for are still in their expected positions, and all the variables the plan does not account for are invisible by definition. It is not fear, it is a kind of weight. You carry it differently from fear. Fear is loud, weight is quiet, you do your job under it. On the morning of day 6, Commander Virles called me to his office at the beginning of third watch. The office was small. All the offices on the compact were small. She was not a ship with excess space, and it had the specific quality of a space lived in by someone who was tidy by discipline rather than by inclination. The commander was tidy by discipline. There was a personal item on the shelf behind his desk, a small carved stone that his daughter had given him when he made commander, and I had never seen it out of its precisely arranged position in the corner of the shelf. He was, by all external measures, a settled man. I had learned to watch his hands when I needed to know whether he was settled or not. His hands were still. "The signal window is at 1400, he said, without preamble. "Fleet has confirmed it will proceed as planned." "Yes, sir." "Your assessment of the Council formation's current awareness level." I had the numbers in my head. I gave them to him. The patient's *S tightening sweep intervals. The marginal change in the * record of considered motion *S active positioning. She had shifted slightly further aft over the past 18 hours, which a human tactical officer would have read as an increase in protective readiness. The fact that Second Voice Terath's last 2 communications had contained a marginally elevated density of clarifying questions about the compact *S technical systems. Questions that were entirely within the scope of normal diplomatic protocol, but that carried, to someone listening carefully, the quality of someone who was building a picture of their own. "They are observant," I said. "They have not detected anything that they can characterize as a contact, but they know that something in the data is not adding up. They are not alarmed yet. They are thorough. There is a difference." Virles looked at the shelf behind his own head, or at least toward the general region of it, in the way people sometimes look toward a known fixed point when they are thinking rather than speaking. "Fleet's assessment is that this window is optimal," he said. "The longer the approach phase continues with the Vigil * undetected, the greater the probability that the Council formation characterizes her as a hostile concealment action rather than a standing diplomatic procedure." "That is my assessment as well, sir." "And if they characterize it as hostile, then the moment of decloak is a threat response rather than a disclosure." "Yes," he looked back at me, "the distinction matters." "The distinction is everything," I said. He said nothing for a moment. Then, 1400, "I want you on the primary comms desk personally, not Ensign Warwick, not the watch officer, you." "I'll be there." "And Solis." He stopped, in the way that experienced officers sometimes stop when they have something to say that falls outside the formal register and they are deciding whether the formality is the point or not. "You have worked this formation for 6 days. You know Terath's speech patterns. When the moment comes, I need you to be the one who reads what happens on the other side of that channel, not the translation software, not the after-action analysis. You." "I understand, sir." I did understand. The translation software would give me the words. What Virles needed was everything that wasn't in the words. I went back to my station, and I worked until 1400. The morning was quiet in the way that mornings are quiet when you are waiting for something. The routine continued. It always continues. This is one of the things I have come to understand about sustained operations, that the routine is not interrupted by the imminence of significant events. It continues because the routine is not aware of significant events, and because the people maintaining the routine are mostly professionals who have decided that the routine is what they can control and therefore the routine is what they will maintain. Ensign Warwick ran the watch. Second Voice Terath's morning communication came in at the scheduled time and covered the scheduled ground, positional coordination for the afternoon session, a technical query about the compact *S communication range, a formulaic expression of the Council's continued appreciation of the diplomatic framework. Terath's voice was, as always, precise. I ran my own analysis against the translation and found nothing outside the expected parameters. I thought about the Vigil *. I thought about her the way you think about something large that you have been told is nearby but cannot see. She was a Meridian-class dreadnought, which meant she was, in practical terms, a weapons platform of a scale that had no direct analog in the Council's observable force inventory. The Meridian class had been designed in the period that fleet engineers referred to, with a certain spare understatement, as the rethinking, the decade after humanity's first serious assessment of what it might actually need to survive an encounter with a technologically comparable or superior civilization. The Meridian was the result of that rethinking expressed in hull form. She was long, not the architectural length of a survey vessel or the functional length of a carrier, but the length of something that had been designed to carry a very great deal of something else at very high velocity. Her spinal armament was not a single weapon in the sense that smaller ships carried single weapons. It was an arrangement, a considered, interlocking arrangement of systems that, in combination, produced effects that our own test range assessments had carefully declined to make available in unclassified documentation. She was also, at this moment, running completely dark inside the sensor envelope of 3 Council vessels and 2 Council corvettes, and had been doing so for 6 days. I had toured the Vigil before departure. The Fleet Admiral had arranged it specifically for the communications and sensor staff of the compact *, because, as she had said in the briefing that preceded the tour, the people who had to sit across from the Council's signals officers for 2 weeks while carrying this particular piece of knowledge deserved to know what that knowledge actually felt like in 3 dimensions. I had appreciated that reasoning at the time, and I appreciated it more in retrospect. There is a difference between knowing the specifications of a Meridian-class dreadnought, which I had known since my 3rd year in fleet communications, because the class had been commissioned during my posting to the survey corridor, and its capabilities had been the subject of a classified briefing that I had attended and taken very careful notes on, and standing in the midships observation bay of an actual Meridian-class dreadnought and understanding, in the specific and physical way that understanding requires being in the presence of a thing, what those specifications meant. The midships observation bay of the everlasting Vigil looked out over the primary weapon's spine from above. I stood there for 6 minutes, because the tour schedule gave us 10 minutes in that bay, and I used 6 of them just looking. The spine ran the full third of the ship that the design drawings had correctly indicated, and the installation of the individual components, the linear driver housings, the charge management arrays, the field projection nodes spaced along the spine at intervals I had memorized from the technical documentation, but which, up close, registered differently. All of that was, as an engineering accomplishment, significant. What I stood looking at for 6 minutes was not the engineering accomplishment. What I stood looking at was the considered, settled quality of it. The spine had the look of something that had been built by people who knew exactly what it was for, and had no ambivalence about building it. No flourish. No architectural emphasis to draw the eye. just the clean, dense reality of a system designed to do one specific thing, and capable of doing it at a scale that the test range assessments had been careful not to put in a document available below maximum restricted classification. I thought, standing in that bay, about the Council's assessment staff, about whatever the asterisk patience of the assembly was designed to collect and relay, about the picture those staff members would build of humanity from their sensor returns during the approach phase, the compact asterisk-S moderate drive signature, her recessed weapons arrays, her profile of a vessel that had things to do and no particular interest in being dramatic about doing them. I thought about the picture they would build, and I thought about what the picture was missing. On the tour, one of the Vigil *S senior weapons officers had been available for questions. She was a quiet woman, practical in the way of engineers who have spent a long time with a specific kind of problem. One of the compact *S junior officers had asked, with the careful phrasing of someone who had decided the question was worth the asking, "Do you know why you're going dark for this approach?" The weapons officer had looked at him for a moment and said, "To give the conversation a chance to happen." I had thought about that answer several times in the 6 days since. I had thought about it at my station this morning. It was the right answer, in the sense that it was accurate, and it was also not the full answer, in the sense that no short answer to a large question can be. The full answer was what I was sitting with. This was the thing I had been sitting with for 6 days, not fear, wait. At 13:57, I settled into the primary communications desk and ran the system check. Everything was in the expected state. I put on the headset and I listened to the carrier frequencies that connected us to the Council formation, and I listened to the carrier frequencies that connected us via a very specific type beam protocol that had a relay point I was not going to think about explicitly, to fleet, and I listened to the general sensor output from the compact *S passive arrays, and I watched the clock. At 13:59, I heard second voice Terath's voice on the technical channel, not a scheduled communication. Terath said, "Communications Officer Solis, we are registering an anomalous return in the frequency range associated with your vessel's drive suppression systems. We are noting this as a technical query. Please advise if there is a systems issue we should be aware of." I keyed the channel. Second voice Terath, "Thank you for the notification. Our engineering systems are currently within normal operational parameters. We will note your observation for our technical log. Please stand by for confirmation." "Thank you," Terath said. The words were the words of routine protocol. The pace of the words was not. Each one landed with a fraction more weight than it should have. I flagged it to Commander Vierles without speaking. He was at his command station. He saw the flag and he looked at me. I gave him the smallest possible movement of my head that still constituted a nod. The patients had found the shape of the absence. Not the Vigil herself, but the hole in the data where the Vigil was. Terath's query was, in the precise language of diplomatic signals procedure, an alert. "We see something we cannot identify. We are telling you we see it. We are doing so in language that allows both sides to treat it as routine if that is what everyone needs it to be." At 14:00, the fleet signal arrived. I know this because I was listening for it and I heard it, a compression burst on the relay frequency, lasting approximately 0.4 of a second, containing a single authenticated command string. I did not see the Vigil receive it. I did not see the Vigil at all, not with any sensor the compact carried, not at that moment. What I saw, what every passive sensor aboard the compact asterisk saw, simultaneously, in a cascade of returns that lit my board like the system had decided to run a full diagnostic without asking, was the consequence of that signal. The Vigil Decloaked. I want to be precise about what this means, because I think precision is important here, and because the word decloaked does not quite carry the weight of what I experienced at that moment. A smaller vessel decloaking is a sensor event. A ship comes into resolution on your arrays, and you register its profile and dimensions and drive signature, and you update your tactical picture. That is decloaking, as a technical matter. What the Vigil Asterisk did was different in degree, to the point of being different in kind. She had been running dark at a distance of approximately 2,300 kilometers from the Ardent Compact, which placed her inside the inner edge of the Council Formation's assumed defensive perimeter, between the Compact and the Asterisk deliberation of the 7th convened Asterisk. When she came into resolution on our passive arrays, she did not come into resolution gradually. She was simply not there, and then she was there, full profile, all systems no longer suppressed. Her mass return alone sufficient to trigger the collision avoidance alerts on every other vessel in the formation. 2,300 kilometers. The deliberation was at approximately 3,100. The record of considered motion was at approximately 4,800. The patience of the assembly was at approximately 6,200. I want to be careful here about the sequence of what I registered, because the sequence matters, and I have seen accounts of moments like this, where the sequence gets compressed in the telling into a simultaneity that was not actually how the experience unfolded. What I registered first was my own board, the cascade of sensor returns. Every passive array on the Compact suddenly illuminated with a return that had not existed one moment before. The mass return came in first, because mass is the bluntest signal and the hardest to miss, and it was the mass return that triggered the collision avoidance alerts. 3 of them in quick succession, each keyed to a different proximity threshold, each resolved as a false alarm within seconds when the Vigil Asterisk's velocity confirmed that she was stationary, not incoming. I noted the alerts and cleared them almost as a single motion. What I registered second was the profile. The Vigil Asterisk's profile coming into full resolution was, in purely informational terms, a substantial event. The passive arrays updated her classification from the suppressed near-zero signature she had been carrying to her full sensor cross-section in approximately 1.4 seconds. I watched the classification tiers update on my secondary board. Mass bracket confirmed. Hull configuration confirmed, drive system confirmed, weapons array warm status confirmed, and each confirmation felt, in the way that significant information sometimes does, less like new data arriving and more like a truth I had been holding at arm's length being allowed, finally, to occupy its actual space. Third, the Council Formation. I watched the Council Formation's response with the specific quality of attention that I have come to associate with moments that are going to live in my memory for the rest of my working life, which is to say, complete, granular, and unforgiving. The record of considered motion moved first. Her drive signature spiked, not a tactical maneuver, not a covering action, the specific spike of emergency mains, full drive immediately, and she came around in a wide arc away from the Vigil Asterisk's position. The reaction was too fast to have been commanded. It was the reaction of a ship whose automated threat response systems had done the calculation before a human equivalent had done it consciously and had acted on the result. She was, by any honest assessment, running. The patience of the assembly did not run. She went dark. Her emission profile collapsed to near zero inside 3 seconds, a ship battening down, making herself a smaller target, watching. This was, in the context of what was happening, actually the most unsettling response of the 3, because it was the response of something that had decided the best survival strategy in the presence of an overwhelming threat was to become invisible. The Asterisk deliberation of the 7th convened. The lead envoy vessel, first speaker Odilith's ship, did something I had not expected. She held position. I spent a fraction of a second registering that, and then I was not thinking about the Asterisk deliberation, because the Asterisk record had fired. It was a single shot, at long range, approximately 9,000 kilometers, fired on a bearing that, when I ran the trajectory, was not pointing at the Vigil asterisk. It was pointing at the asterisk Ardent Compact asterisk, not with precision. The shot was not a precision engagement. It was an emergency discharge on a bearing that covered everything in a 90-degree arc in the general direction, away from the asterisk record asterisk S current heading. And we happened to be in that arc. And the shot grazed our bow plating at a velocity sufficient to trigger 3 secondary alerts and score a line through the forward sensor mast mounting that was, according to the damage report that appeared on my secondary board within 4 seconds. Approximately 16 centimeters short of taking the mast itself. The bridge was very quiet for a moment. Commander Wireless said into the intercom, "Damage control acknowledge." The damage control officer acknowledged. Wireless said, "Point defense stand by." "Hold." The point defense officer said, "Holding, sir." I said nothing. I was listening to the carrier frequencies. Second voice Terath's channel was open. I had not opened it. Terath had. The carrier frequency was live and there was the sound, if you could call it sound. It was a set of acoustic frequencies that the translation system rendered as the carrier tone of council communication, the preverbal signal that meant an exchange was being initiated, and then nothing. Terath had opened the channel and then not spoken, and I sat listening to that silence and I thought, they are assessing. Terath is at a console somewhere on the patients, and Terath is watching a sensor board, just as I am. And Terath is building a picture of what just happened and deciding what to say to me about it. I waited. The Vigil asterisk had not moved. Her position was constant. Her systems were live. I could read her now, read her properly with the full clarity of an unsuppressed profile, and what I read was a ship in complete tactical readiness. Weapons arrays warm but not spun up to active targeting solution. Drive at maneuver power. All active sensors covering the council formation in a full sphere arrangement. She was present. She was prepared. She was not acting. The record of considered motion had arrested her emergency burn at approximately 30,000 kilometers and was holding position. Her drive signature had come down from emergency to something closer to sustained cruise, still elevated, not retreating further. The deliberation was holding. The patience was dark and holding. The shot had come and gone, and nothing had followed it. I thought about the 16 centimeters. Then Terath spoke. The translation system rendered it. I read the text and I listened to the acoustic rendering simultaneously, because in high-stakes communications I always do both, because there are qualities in the acoustic rendering that the text cannot capture. Terath said, "Communications Officer Solis, we are assessing. The action taken by our second escort was unauthorized. We are assessing." There were pauses in places where the translation system indicated pauses existed in the source signal, and those pauses had a quality I want to be careful about describing accurately. They were not the pauses of someone searching for words. They were the pauses of someone who had the words and was deciding what to do with the fact that they had them. I keyed my channel. I said, "Second voice Terath. The Ardent Compact has sustained minor hull scoring on the forward sensor assembly. No casualties. I am conveying your statement to our commander." A pause, then, "We acknowledge." I covered my microphone and spoke quietly to Commander Wireless. He was already moving. He had heard enough. The commander's exchange with first speaker Odilith took 11 minutes. I monitored the technical channel through the entire duration. Terath did not speak. The carrier frequency remained open, and Terath was there. I could hear the background acoustic signature of the patient's *S communications environment, which I had been listening to for 6 days and which I knew as well as I knew my own workstation. And Terath was listening. Not recording, not relaying, not filing. Listening. I thought, Terath is doing exactly what I am doing. What Commander Wireless said to first speaker Odilith, in summary form. The full exchange is in the diplomatic record, and I am not going to reproduce it, was this. The Terran Meridian-class Dreadnought Everlasting Vigil had been accompanying the Ardent Compact since before the transit threshold. Her presence had not been disclosed as a matter of standing Terran diplomatic procedure in first contact approach situations, the same procedure that governed the compact S own system's configuration, which had been set to present a reduced capability profile for the duration of the approach phase. The Vigil S Decloak had been executed at a prearranged fleet signal, at a prearranged time, as part of a prearranged protocol. The purpose of the protocol was disclosure. The Terran Diplomatic Service's position was that any treaty arrangement entered into without a full and honest accounting of both parties' actual capabilities was not a treaty. It was a misunderstanding deferred. The Vigil was what humanity brought to this engagement. The compact S commander believed it was important for the Council to see that before anything was signed. There was a very long silence after the commander finished. I listened to the silence on the technical channel. Terath's carrier frequency was still open. I could hear the background acoustic signature. I heard at one point what I believed was a secondary voice, not the translation-tagged register of a formal communication, but the quick, unguarded cadence of someone speaking to someone nearby, and the translation system flagged it as out of scope and did not render it. I made a note to flag the acoustic file for the intelligence staff. Whatever Terath said, in that unguarded moment, to whoever was nearby, was something I wanted someone to look at carefully. Then first speaker Odilith spoke. The translation of Odilith's response was 9 words in the primary diplomatic register, and I will reproduce those 9 words exactly because they are in the official record, and because I think they are the most accurate characterization of what I witnessed in those 11 minutes that anyone has produced. Odilith said, "We had not considered that this was the thing you would show us." Commander Vireless said, "We thought it was better that you knew." Another silence, shorter. Odilith said, "The asterisk record will stand down. The matter of the discharge is a council internal matter. We will address it internally and formally." You have and here the translation system produced a notation I had seen once before in a different diplomatic context, which was, no direct equivalent in Terran standard, closest rendering, a word that means both regret for a thing done and acknowledgement that the thing cannot be undone, and that both parties are still present, and that this is what matters. I read the notation. I took a breath. Vireless said very quietly, "Acknowledged." There was a pause, then Odilith said, "We would like to continue." I want to try to describe what happened after that, and I want to be honest that I am not sure I have the vocabulary for it. So I am going to use the vocabulary I have and acknowledge its limitations. What happened was, nothing happened, no further discharges. No emergency burns. No change in the Vigil S status. No change in the compact S status. No change in the diplomatic agenda that Commander Vireless and First Speaker Odilith had been working toward for the previous 6 days. The second half of that day's formal session proceeded on schedule. The technical channels exchanged the expected traffic. Second voice Terath and I spoke 3 more times before the day cycle closed, and each exchange was, by every technical measure, within the expected parameters of diplomatic protocol. But something had changed in the texture of those exchanges, not something I can point to in the transcripts. In the transcripts, what Terath and I said to each other in the last 3 exchanges of that day was largely indistinguishable from what we had said to each other in the first 3 days. If you ran a frequency analysis on Terath's communication patterns from before and after the decloak, you would find marginal shifts in pause duration and word order complexity. Nothing that would clear the significance threshold in any automated analysis I know how to run. What I noticed was not in the frequency analysis. It was in the quality I mentioned earlier, the one I have come to associate with the voice of someone who has studied a language from recordings rather than from experience. Before the decloak, Terath's speech had the precision of someone executing a learned protocol. After the decloak, Terath's speech had the precision of someone who had decided to be precise for their own reasons rather than because precision was the protocol. There was, in the language my grandmother would have used, a difference between manners and consideration. Manners is what you do because it is expected. Consideration is what you do because you have thought about the person on the other side of the exchange and decided they deserve it. After the decloak, second voice Terath was considering me. I do not know exactly what had changed in Terath's assessment of who I was and what I represented. I have my theories. I think Terath understood, in a way that required the decloak to make concrete, that I had known about the vigil asterisk for the entirety of the approach phase, that I had sat across the technical channel from Terath for 6 days, knowing exactly what was running dark in the patient's *S blind spot, and had conducted every exchange with Terath in the precise register of diplomatic protocol, without deception, without concealment of the things I was permitted to discuss, without any of the small manipulations of emphasis and framing that technically honest communication can still be made to carry. I had not lied to Terath. I had also not told Terath the truth. This is a distinction that the Council's diplomatic framework, based on everything our intelligence staff had assessed about it, treated as a fundamental one. They had a word for the category of action that lies between a lie and a full disclosure. I had been briefed on it, and the word did not carry a negative valence in their framework. It was simply a category of action, a recognized, legitimate thing. I think Terath had spent 6 days wondering which category my silences fell into. I think the decloak told Terath what category they fell into, and I think Terath found the answer unexpectedly tolerable. On day 7, the treaty framework document was opened for formal discussion. Commander Virlas and First Speaker Odilith worked through it with the methodical patience of 2 people who had a great deal to say to each other, and had decided that saying it correctly mattered more than saying it quickly. I maintained the technical channel. Terath and I kept our exchanges within protocol. The record of considered motion returned to the formation, somewhat aft of her previous position, and maintained a distance that my assessments logged as defensive elevated but not hostile active. The position of a ship that had been frightened, and had not entirely finished being frightened but had decided to stay. The patience remained dark for the first 3 hours of day 7. When she came back to active profile, her sweep interval was longer than it had ever been in the approach phase. 1 sweep every 7 hours, slow and broad. The sensor signature of a ship that had decided it already knew what was out there, and was maintaining the sweeps as a formality rather than an urgent inquiry. I noted it without comment. I thought it was probably the most considered thing any ship in that formation did in the entire 14 days we spent together. The vigil asterisk held position. She did not maneuver, she did not scan, she did not demonstrate. She was there. She continued to be there. This was, I had been told in the briefing before departure, the point. She was not a threat that had been introduced and then withdrawn. She was a fact that had been introduced. Facts, unlike threats, do not require maintenance. You do not need to keep gesturing at a fact. You simply allow it to exist in the shared picture that both parties are building, and the shared picture does not require the fact to move in order to continue registering it. The vigil asterisk held position and the treaty framework was discussed, and on the 9th day, the points of fundamental principle were agreed in broad form. On the 11th day, the technical annexes were accepted. On the 13th day, the formal instrument of provisional agreement was exchanged in the standard Terran diplomatic format and in the Council's equivalent, a document type whose name translated approximately as a record of what we have decided to hold to, which I thought was, in its unpretentious plainness, one of the better descriptions of what a treaty actually is. On the 14th day, the Council formation made its departure in the same direction from which it had arrived, on schedule, in the precise moment that first speaker Odilith had communicated 3 days earlier. Commander Virlas and Odilith exchanged the formal closing phrases. I exchanged the closing protocol with second voice Terath. Before I describe what happened in those final exchanges, I want to say something about the 7 days between the treaty signing and the departure, because I think those 7 days were as significant as anything in the 14, and I think they are the part of the account most likely to be smoothed over in favor of the more legible drama of the Decloak and the shot and the 9 words. Those 7 days were, by any external measure, administrative. The formal sessions between Virlas and Odilith continued in their methodical rhythm. The technical channels carried the traffic that treaty implementation required, the procedural details of the mutual observation clause, the communication protocols for the transit corridors, the preliminary framework for the dispute mechanism. Second voice Terath and I worked through lists of technical specifications for the communication architecture. The compact *S repair crew finished the work on the forward sensor mast. The record of considered motion held her elevated defensive position without closing to formation proximity, and nobody on either side raised the question of whether she should. The Patience ran her long, slow sweeps. The Vigil * held position. What I mean when I say those 7 days were significant is this. Both sides had reason, after the Decloak, to protect themselves by moving faster, to compress the remaining work into the minimum necessary time, conclude the framework, and make the departure with the formalities observed, and the interaction as brief as possible. Speed in the aftermath of a frightening moment is a natural response. Put the thing behind you. Create the distance. Carry the agreement back to your respective authorities and let the question of what it means be worked out in comfortable abstraction, away from the physical presence of the thing that was frightening. Neither side did that. Odilith asked, on day 8, whether the Terran Diplomatic Service would be willing to extend the session by 2 days to allow the full technical annexes to be reviewed in detail, rather than provisionally accepted and finalized later by staff who had not been present for the approach phase. Virlas agreed without consulting Fleet. I noted in my log that this was the moment I was most certain the treaty would hold. Not because the request was significant in itself, it was an administrative extension, nothing more, but because of what it meant to ask for it. The Council's lead envoy, 7 days after a ship in her formation had fired on a Terran vessel, was asking to stay longer, to remain in proximity to the Vigil *, to continue the work in person rather than at a distance. This was not the action of a party that had decided the encounter was intolerable. It was the action of a party that had decided the encounter was worth the discomfort. I flagged it for Virlas. He read my note and said nothing, which was, from Virlas, a clear signal that he had reached the same conclusion. The extension was 2 days. On the 13th day, the formal instrument of provisional agreement was exchanged in the standard Terran diplomatic format and in the Council's equivalent, a document type whose name translated approximately as a record of what we have decided to hold to, which I thought was, in its unpretentious plainness, one of the better descriptions of what a treaty actually is. The translation system rendered it without flagging it as out of scope, which told me that Terath had used the formal register deliberately, in full awareness that it would be captured and rendered. Terath said, "I will note in my personal record that our exchanges were conducted with honesty." I said, "I will note the same." Terath said, "I hope we speak again." I said, "I expect that we will." The carrier frequency closed. I sat at my station for a few minutes after the Council formation had completed its departure burn, and the sensor returns had begun to show the diminishing profile of 3 ships and 2 corvettes accelerating away from us on a heading back toward the transit threshold. I did not do anything in particular during those minutes. I watched the returns on my board, and I thought about the 14 days that had just concluded, and I tried to decide what I actually felt about them. I did not arrive at a clean conclusion. I am not sure I expected to. Here is what I could say with confidence. A treaty had been concluded. The Council's parliamentary coalition, representing 14 member polities across a volume of space that our survey staff had been carefully avoiding characterizing as a threat corridor for the past several years, had agreed to the provisional framework that the Terran Diplomatic Service had been working toward since the first confirmed sensor contact 18 months ago. The agreement covered 6 areas of foundational principle: territorial demarcation in the transit corridors we shared, communication protocol, non-interference in respective internal governance, a mutual observation clause covering significant military movements, a dispute resolution mechanism that was clumsy but present, and what the formal document called a statement of recognized standing, which translated without loss as the acknowledgement by each party that the other was a legitimate power with whom agreement was both possible and worth seeking. 6 areas, 14 days, the provisional framework. These were the things that would be in the official record, and the official record was not wrong about any of them. What the official record would not capture, what I have never seen the official record capture in 11 years about any significant exchange I have participated in, was the texture of the thing, the feel of the 14 days in the body, the weight I mentioned at the beginning which had been sitting in me since the pre-departure briefing and which had shifted on day 7 into something else. Not lighter, different. The weight had been the weight of the unknown outcome. What replaced it was harder to name. The weight of an outcome that had occurred and that could not now be undone, which is a different kind of weight, heavier in some registers, lighter in others, and in a certain sense neither, because it is simply what is now true. The Vigil asterisk had decloaked and a ship had fired, and the 16-centimeter margin had held and the treaty had been signed. All of those things were true simultaneously. None of them canceled any of the others. I thought about what Commander Vierles had said to First Speaker Odilith. The part about the compact asterisk S reduced capability profile during the approach, the deliberate presentation of a lesser face, and how the Vigil asterisk was what humanity actually brought. He had said it without apology and without emphasis. He had said it as a plain statement of fact, with the care of someone who understood that the plain statement of fact was precisely what the situation required. Not a threat, not a boast, simply what was true. I thought about Odilith's response, the 9 words. We had not considered that this was the thing you would show us. I had turned those 9 words over a great many times in the 3 days between Odilith saying them and the treaty being signed. I had thought about what was inside them. I had thought about all the things Odilith and the Council's assessment staff had presumably considered that humanity might show them in this first formal engagement. The obvious things, the things any galaxy-capable power might anticipate from a new one. The size of the fleet, the reach of the weapons, the shape of the territorial ambition, the list of demands, the recognizable grammar of power showing itself to power. The thing they had not considered was the choice. The Vigil asterisk S presence inside their formation for 6 days, while the compact ran diplomatic protocol, was not a demonstration of capability. Any power with a working stealth system could put a ship inside an enemy formation. What the Vigil asterisk represented was the decision to put her there in the context of a diplomatic approach, not as a weapon held behind the back, but as a fact held in reserve until the moment was right to make it known. The distinction was subtle. It was the difference between a concealed weapon and a withheld disclosure. Both involve keeping something out of sight. Only one of them is compatible with the kind of treaty that is worth keeping. First Speaker Odilith was, by every assessment I had seen, an experienced diplomat who had conducted significant engagements on behalf of the Council for a long time. Odilith had presumably seen a great many versions of power presenting itself. What I think surprised Odilith, what the 9 words carried, was the specific combination, the capability, which was evident, and the restraint, which was not an absence of capability but a considered application of it, and the transparency about the restraint, which was the thing that the grammar of power rarely includes because it is the thing that power most often does not trust the other side to deserve. Virlas had trusted Odilith to deserve it. I do not know, and I will not know in my lifetime, whether that trust was placed correctly. Treaties are intentions, not guarantees. The provisional framework would face the full council in its formal session, where 14 member polities would apply 14 different sets of interests to its terms, and the outcome of that process was not something I or anyone in the Terran diplomatic service had any ability to predict with confidence. The Vigil asterisk was a fact in the Council's awareness now. What the Council did with that fact was the Council's decision. The record of considered motion had fired a shot that had scored our bow plating to a depth that the repair crews were still working on when we made our own departure burn on day 15. The Council's formal acknowledgement of the incident was in the record. What would come of it, whether it would remain an acknowledged internal matter or whether it would become something more, was also not something I could predict. I was in this as I was in most things, a sensor operator. My job was to read what was there, not to determine what it meant in the long run, not to decide what would happen next, to read what was there accurately, completely, without self-deception, and without the kind of optimism that smooths data into shapes more comfortable than the actual shapes. What was there on day 15, as the asterisk compact completed her departure burn, and the Vigil asterisk fell in alongside, visible now, every return clear, her mass and profile and drive signature no longer something I had to infer from the shape of an absence, was a treaty and a warning and a channel still open. I noted it in my log. I took off my headset. I did not know in that moment what the Council would make of humanity. I did not know what we would make of them. The 14 days had been, in the technical sense, a success. The agreement had been reached, the framework was in place, both formations had departed without significant incident, the threshold had been crossed. In the personal sense, the sense that I have spent this account trying to be honest about, the 14 days had been the sustained experience of two parties trying very hard to see each other clearly, and finding, in the end, that clarity was possible and was not comfortable, and was nonetheless the only thing worth pursuing. Second Voice Terath had said, I will note in my personal record that our exchanges were conducted with honesty. I had noted the same. We were not friends. We were not allies, not in the sense that the word carries between parties who have fought beside each other and know the specific weight of that. We were now two powers who had looked at each other without the mediating veil of performed capability, and who had found the view tolerable enough to sign a document, and who would, in the days and months and probably decades to come, have to decide what to do with what they had seen. The compact ran at cruise power toward the transit threshold. The Vigil kept pace. 6 days from now, we would make the transit and go home, and the report I would file would run to several hundred pages, and most of those pages would be frequencies and intervals and translation flags, and the dry technical accounting of 14 days of formal contact. And somewhere in those pages, in a subsection that the standard filing format titled Assessments, Subjective, I would write what I have written here, that the most important thing in the 14 days was not the asterisk Vigil asterisk S presence, and not the shot that scored our bow, and not the 9 words, and not the 6-point framework or the translated treaty language or the formal instrument of provisional agreement. The most important thing was that both sides stayed. When the Vigil asterisk decloaked and the Council formation fractured and the shot came across the arc, both sides had the option to stop. The asterisk record had demonstrated that clearly enough. To stop, to burn, to refuse the weight of the moment by putting distance between themselves and it. They could have done that. We could have done the equivalent, could have read the shot as an act of war rather than an act of panic, could have brought the Vigil asterisk S weapons arrays online, and made the grammar of the moment into something that would have taken years to undo, if it could be undone at all. Neither side did that. The asterisk deliberation had held position. Vierlas had ordered point defense to hold, and in the silence that followed, the specific, weighted, non-empty silence of two parties absorbing what had just happened and choosing what to do with it, both sides had stayed in the room. That was the thing I would carry from those 14 days, not the capability which was real, not the treaty which was provisional, the staying. The decision, made in the moment that matters most, to remain present with something difficult rather than to make the difficulty go away by other means. I do not know what the Council calls that in their formal vocabulary. They may have a word that carries the weight of it precisely, the way their treaty document name carried the weight of its meaning without decoration. I would not be surprised if they did. They were, as I had come to understand over 14 days, a people who took language seriously. We call it in ours a beginning.